Good morning, students. Welcome to the session on environmental education, EE31. I'm your tutor. My name is David Sampson, and I'm basically here to guide you through this presentation to prepare yourself for the upcoming examination. So, with the objective of this specific presentation is to develop your understanding on the content of the module itself, to gain an understanding of the different ways of questioning, and then review the aspects of writing examinations, and then serves to support you with mastering and application of the learning outcomes. As you know, this specific course has certain learning outcomes for each of the three sections of the course, and you should familiarize yourself with these learning outcomes. There are some technical aspects related to writing assignments. I know they are focusing on preparation for the examinations, but it's also important to remind you of whenever you do your assignments, there are certain things that you should keep in mind also with examinations, especially when it comes to marking allocations. You know that you have to ensure that your assignments has the correct outline, your table of content, your introduction, your page numbering, your heading, your subheadings, your conclusions, and your references. I'm sure that you are all familiar with these technical aspects around the assignments, especially also text citations. Whenever you use information which is not yours and you use it directly, you also need to reference the content that you are using. And obviously you will lose marks if you do not reference or cite. Now, what is important for this presentation is the aspects related to the examination. Please, I'm not providing you with a scope of what is going to be in the examination. I'm guiding you in terms of how you need to prepare yourself for the examination. As you know, there are three sections, which is the geography, the history, and biology. In the examination, each of these sections carries 40 marks each, and then the 40 marks is then subdivided into different questions with different marks, giving you the total of 40 for each section. What is important for you to observe in the examination is the level of questioning. I'm sure that by now you are familiar with what I mean by the level of questioning. It's important that you understand what the question requires of you when you read through the exam paper. You should be aware of the key words in each and every question, whether the question is asking you to describe, to explain, to name, to list, or to state. Obviously, when you are asked to explain or to describe, it's obvious that you are not going to name or list. So you need to, because the question, depending on the number of marks of the question, it is important for you to understand what the question requires of you. If you do not explain, if you do not describe, obviously you will get less marks. It's important that you read your questions correctly in order to answer the questions correctly. If you read it wrongly, you will answer the question wrongly. So it's important that you take that into consideration. It's important that you write neatly, clearly, and consider grammatical correctness. Sometimes it's very difficult to read your answers if it's not clear or you do not write neatly. It makes it difficult, especially during the marking of the exam papers. Answer to what is required. If you do not answer the question, you will not be rewarded. Thank you. The next slide is also related to the examination. Make sure that you read the instructions first on the question paper, or answer all the questions. Strictly follow the numbering of the questions as it appears in the question papers. Check the allocation of marks shown in brackets after each question. And when you are not sure about an answer, move on to the next question. You can always go back to the unanswered question because you will save time. If you spend a lot of time to a question which you are not able to answer at the time, move on so that you can use that time that you save to go back to that specific question. Now, the first section is in relation to the geography section. The geography section, covers a lot of issues around the geographical aspects, which is related to earthquakes and volcanoes, global warming, weathering, and climate. Now, under each section, for example, like earthquakes and volcanoes, it's important that you know the difference between a volcano and an earthquake. And then what is the difference between the different boundaries that you get, divergent boundaries and transform fault boundaries. So you need to be able to distinguish or differentiate between either a volcano or an earthquake, and then the different boundaries that we do get. Obviously, it's not only about the differentiating between a volcano and an earthquake. It's also important to know what are the impact of the environmental impacts of volcanoes, for example, on the environment. Sometimes not only on the environment, but also on people and the economy. Global warming is very important in terms of you have to know how the earth is heated, and then the effect of climate on natural vegetation, and then the main factors which affect climate. All this in relation to global warming. Obviously, you studied the section on weathering. You know the three basic types of weathering, and then the other aspect is the issue around the stages of the hydrological cycle. We are talking about the cycle, so the stages of the hydrological cycle. The next section focuses on climate. The factors, you have to know these factors that affect climate. You have to also know what is the effect of climate on natural vegetation. We're talking here on the plants, for example, and other natural vegetation. And then it's important that as a teacher, you should be able to interpret a climate graph and what learners need to observe from the graph, which means that what is a climate graph? How do we interpret a climate graph? And what learners need to do in order to observe for example, what a climate graph is all about. So basically there's data involved, and learners need to know how to interpret a climate graph. That is just a few of the issues on the geography section. Obviously, this is not all of them, but it's important that you know that to distinguish between the different sections, especially in relation to what I've just highlighted for you. What is also important in geography, as with the other sections as well, is that you need to be able to define certain concepts or certain terms under the geography section. I have highlighted a few concepts, for example, as examples. The concept of geoformology, compaction, topography, population geography, economic geography, and population geography. You should be able to distinguish between, what does the term population geography means, what does the term economic geography means, and what the term population geography means. Another concept is, for example, climate, desertification, and precipitation. What you can do is you can create a table for yourself, like the one that I am using here, so that you can you have the concept on the left-hand side, and then write out the meaning of the concept on the right hand side. So basically you can create a little table for yourself in order for you to get the meaning of these concepts. We can now look at some sample questions in geography. Questions, you can be asked these type of questions, as these are examples or sample questions, where you need to define the following terms, which means to test your conceptual understanding. What do you understand by some of the concepts? I'm referring back to this slide where we talk about these concepts, where you can be asked to define. A question on global warming, for example, how is the earth heated? There's 5 stages of the hydrological cycle, the environmental impact of, for example, of volcanic eruptions. What is the impact? And the focus here is on environmental impact. Differentiate between divergent and transform fault boundaries. Differentiate between a volcano and an earthquake. And then strategies to manage the effects of earthquakes. Now, if you need to do that, for example, strategies to manage, we are talking about, in the first place, we are talking about earthquakes. Okay? Now, what you should, for example, this question is focusing on earthquakes. It asks you, for example, you should mention strategies to do what? To manage earthquakes, which means that you have to explain what strategies can be used to manage the impact of earthquakes. Usually you know that these strategies is usually done, it is before earthquakes happens. Then which main factors, the main factors which affect climate, and then the factors of soil formation, and then teaching learners to interpret a climate graph and what learners need to observe from the graph, as I've mentioned in the previous slide. In geography, we also make use of maps, okay, different kinds of maps. If you have, for example, asked on what is a sketch map and what a sketch map is used for. So you should be able to know the different kinds of maps and what these maps are used for. There are also certain instruments that are used, for example, when we measure weather. And one of the equipment that we use is called the Stevenson screen. And I think that you all are familiar with the Stevenson screen. Now, it's the Stevenson screen, obviously, and the instruments, for example, that one get in a Stevenson screen, and what these instruments are used for. And then also important is the issue around the 3 basic types of weathering. You all know what weathering is all about, and then the 3 basic types of weathering and what these 3 basic types of weathering involves. We can use diagrams in geography. There's a lot of diagrams that we can use, and you can also use diagrams in the exam, in assignments. Now, with this specific diagram as an example of the hydrological cycle, what can happen is that the question can be based on the diagram, which means that you have to study the diagram and then answer the question, which is then based on the diagram. It is a visual, the issue of the hydrological cycle is visualized for you, which means that there's the diagram, you look at the diagram and then answer the question based on the diagram itself. And then, for example, this diagram, it can ask you, it requires you to explain what happens, for example, at X as labeled in the diagram. Sometimes the diagrams are numbered. It's either A, B, C, or in this, for example, in this example, it's a X, for example. You can use an A or a B. Doesn't matter, as long as you know, you study the diagram correctly and then answer the question based on the diagram. Okay, that is the diagram. History section, which is the second section I'm going to focus on, is that what I found is that a lot of students they do poorly in the history section. I don't know why, but for one or other reason, they tend to not do well. What is important in the history section is that the history section focus on the following. It is Namibian history, and then there's world history as well. Now, the Namibian history section focus on the South African occupation in 1915. You need to explain what is the reasons and why South Africa occupied Namibia in 1915. So they didn't do it just because out of free will. There are reasons why it happens. Another focus is the issue around the apartheid system. Where you need to be able to explain what the concept apartheid, for example, means, as well as the different apartheid laws introduced and how it was structured, and how it affected how this apartheid system affected the Namibian people. So it was introduced, and then obviously what was the effect on the people themselves. Various political parties were established either to resist or fight apartheid in Namibia, so you have to know who those parties were, when were they formed, and what was the reason for forming these parties. Okay. The next section is the world history section. You have to pay particularly attention to the issue around peace treaties, and then the effectiveness of peace treaties. We know that a lot of peace treaties were formed to preserve peace. But the other question that you need to ask yourself is, was these treaties effective? Did they work? Or were they ineffective? So if they were effective, obviously you need to explain why. For example, to maintain peace is not the only reason it was effective. If it wasn't effective, then you also need to explain why they were not effective. What is the reasons for them not being effective? The League of Nations was formed before the United Nations. So the League of Nations, that was the bodies that made up the League of Nations, the weaknesses and the successes of the League of Nations. Do not confuse, the weaknesses and the successes of the League of Nations with the United Nations, and do not confuse the successes of the United Nations with the League of Nations. So separate the two bodies and then look at how they operated and how they were successful or not, because it's important. In the world history section, it also covers world wars, World War I, World War II, and then obviously the Cold War as well as the Vietnam War. Look at the difference between the Cold War and the Vietnam War. What is the meaning of the word Cold War, and then the causes of the Cold War? What caused the Cold War? What was the reason, and why NATO and the Warsaw Pact was formed after World War II? So yes, that is just a brief explanation on the how you can separate the history section in terms of Namibian history and world history. Like in geography, I've mentioned that there are some concepts in geography. There are also concepts in history. As you can see, I've mentioned a few as an example. Capitalism, imperialism, militarism, nationalism, socialism, Cold War, apartheid, and genocide. You can create a little table for yourself also, as I've explained on the geography section, so that you understand the meaning of these concepts and what they mean. Also, sample questions in relation to history, for example, is what is meant by the following terms: reserve, apartheid, genocide, Cold War. It can be other concepts as well. It's just to test your understanding of the concepts. The reasons for South African occupation in 1915, apartheid laws introduced during 1964, the effectiveness of peace treaties, the effect of apartheid system on black people in Namibia, why NATO and Warsaw Pact were formed after the Second World War, the weaknesses or successes of the League of Nations, the weaknesses or successes of the United Nations, and for example, the consequences of the Vietnam War. Here you need to explain what the consequences were. But you must also remember that, as you can see on the slide, I've not phrased it as questions, okay? Which means that you can be asked to explain the reasons or describe the reasons. You can, for example, be asked to name the laws introduced in 1964, and then explain the effectiveness of the peace treaties to preserve world peace. And then also highlight the consequences of the Vietnam War, or explain the consequences of the Vietnam War, depending on how the question is phrased and the number of marks allocated to each question. It's very important. Yes, and then the biology section. We come to the last section, and this section, there's a lot of content to be covered under this section. There you have the study of mitosis and meiosis and the difference between the two, asexual and sexual reproduction, advantages and disadvantages, the issue of sexual reproduction in human with reference to male and female reproductive systems, male and female and functions of each structure. I will explain that in the slide, in the other slide that I have, especially where I have the diagrams. The section also focuses on the role of hormones, whether it's testosterone or estrogen, and then the effect and the function of hormones in the male and the female body. The role of testosterone and estrogen, labeling the male and female sex organs, the concept of zygote, genotype, phenotype, and then natural selection and artificial selection. Also covered in the section under biology, especially, is the focus on the DNA. You know that this is the code on which all life is based, but specifically the function of DNA. Issues covered under the biology section also is seed disposal, the various ways of how seeds can be disposed of. It also covers issues around global warming, and then specifically looking at what global warming is, and then also looking at the effects of global warming, and then conservation, the importance of conservation of the natural environment, meaning looking after the environment. When we talk about conservation, we talk about looking after and protecting the natural environment. And why is it important that we do conserve the natural environment? As you can see, we have the same table here when it comes to the definition of concepts from a biological perspective. There we have different concepts, for example, and then you should be able to explain the meaning of each concept. You can also expect some diagrams under the biological section in an examination where you can be given a diagram and then you need to answer the question based on the diagram. For example, it can be a diagram on the visual aspect of a fetus inside the uterus during pregnancy, or it can be a diagram on showing the male and female reproductive system. Now, you know that these diagrams can show different parts of the fetus inside the uterus, and then it can require you to label structures and explain the function of each of the structure or structures as labeled in the diagrams. I will show you in the example just now. Okay, there, for example, we have the two diagrams. The one diagram is of the male reproductive system, and the other one is of the female reproductive system. As you can see, they are labeled, which means that we use A, B, C, D. That's the labeling, and the labeling is usually a structure is usually labeled, so you have to know what structure that is, and what is the function, what is the name of the structure, and what is the function of the specific structure. The same as with the female reproductive system, it's labeled A, B, C, D, and then you have to know the structure and the function. Okay, for example, if you need to label the male and reproductive system and the functions, for example, the male reproductive system, you have the seminal vesicle, and then the sperm duct. For example, the sperm duct is the structure which is being labeled, and then you have to know that the function of the sperm duct is a structure which is usually cut during a vasectomy. Urethra, that's the structure which makes fluids in which the sperm can swim. Okay. You can do the same for the female reproductive system. You create a little table where you indicate the structure and then explain the function of the structure. Sample questions can range from functions of estrogen in the female body, the role of the placenta, for example, state the function of the ovary, the effect of testosterone in males, the function of DNA, the risks of cloning, differentiate between sexually and asexually reproduction. The question can also be in the form of a statement. For example, plants can reproduce both sexually and asexually. Now differentiate between the two types of reproduction. Looking at the disadvantages of asexual reproduction, the negative effects of global warming, and then the importance of conservation of the natural environment. Okay, we have come to the end of our presentation. So I hope that these slides will be helpful to you in terms of doing your preparation. And I want to wish you all the best for the next upcoming exam. Thank you.